Welcome everyone to our first Plain English Roundtable of 2022. Is it too late to say Happy New Year? It probably is.
No, it's still January.
This roundtable series was looking at plain English communications and what that means for businesses. With the help of industry experts, we'll be discussing specific legal and commercial issues around all types of business communications. We'll be including customer case studies, and we'll be describing practical tips and tricks for how companies can incorporate plain English into their workflow. We want these roundtables to be a resource for businesses to help them communicate better with their customers. To that end, these roundtables are being recorded and will be available on demand on the Plain English Law YouTube channel. Please be assured that these recordings will only show the faces of the panelists. The names and profile pics of attendees will all be hidden. If you have any questions or privacy concerns about that, please send me an email directly. I'll put my address in the chat window. So our next virtual roundtable will be in 2 months' time, and it's scheduled for Thursday, 17 March. The topic then will be challenges and opportunities of intercultural business communications. The industry guest will be Jerry Higgins, and he'll be looking at this topic from a global scale, bringing in his experiences from an extensive career in international shipping. And because of the multicultural makeup of businesses in the UK, we'll also be looking at this topic from a local scale, discussing how companies can take advantage of their internal resources to provide insights on our multicultural marketplace. There will be an Eventbrite link on our social media pages posted early next week, so keep an eye on that, and please sign up. So for today's roundtable, we'll be talking about the accessibility of business communications. This includes everything from your marketing content to client presentations to legal documents. Key to accessibility, we'll also be discussing the assumptions we make about our customers. That is, their ability to receive or not receive the messages we send them. So I'll be asking our panel, do the assumptions we make about our customers actually undermine our efforts to connect with them? So with that, I'll introduce our panel. Panel, if you can give me a wave when I call your name, that would be helpful. So for our first two co-hosts, first we have Niamh Kelly, CEO and founder of Tigum. Tigum is a communication dynamics platform whose mission is to enable companies to use language in a more accessible way to benefit both their clients and their brand. Niamh is joining us from Dublin. Welcome to you, Niamh.
Thank you.
Next, we have Trevor Fenton, who is a solicitor and the founder of Plain English Law. Plain English Law is a boutique commercial law and data privacy practice based in Dundee, Scotland. Welcome, Trevor.
Good afternoon.
Our first guest is Carrie Clues from Chatterton Solicitors. Carrie is an equality and disability rights lawyer who specializes in assisting a wide range of clients who wish to bring claims for discrimination. Carrie deals with many discrimination cases, both in goods and services and in the education center, and she also supports this disabled community when it comes to accessibility of services. Carrie is joining us from Sheffield today. Welcome, Carrie.
Hello.
And last but not least, our second industry expert is Paul Ulitz. For over 30 years, Paul has run companies that have helped businesses be more effective at what they do. As the founder of his current project, Lasting Legacy Planning, and as well as being a master licensee for the platform HoneyPro, Paul uses plain English to help his clients understand the process of will writing and estate planning. In his own words, Paul is a connector and protector of people, their health, and their assets. Paul is joining us from the Lake District, which I believe you've just moved to. Congratulations. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you very much, and hello.
Excellent. All right. So what I'm going to do is, Niamh and Carrie, I'm going to start with you, with your background. I want you to be our guides on this deep dive into accessible language. So let's start off. What's with the question, what are we talking about when we speak about accessible language, and who is the audience that we're aiming accessible language at? Maybe Niamh, you go ahead.
Sure, thanks. So in a really easy way, when we're talking about accessibility in terms of language, it's really, are we communicating in a way that everybody can understand, or the majority of people can understand? So for businesses, really, there are two types of communications. There's the external to the public, who you hope will become your customers, your potential customers. And then there's your internal communications as well. So if you just look even at the external, what's on your website, what's in your terms and conditions, your data, what you're trying to sell, are you using language that can be understood by a lot of people? And one thing that we do, especially if English is your first language, we're writing at a level that we're able to understand, but often we forget about the level or the ability of the potential users, the potential readers. So in the general population, there are people with dyslexia, people that English isn't their first language, people who might have different literacy skills. And so to take on board, the idea that not everybody can speak at maybe a high level, read at a high level, it's just trying to use more simple terms to explain ideas in order to engage your potential clients and bring them in, which can be really good for your business as well, because any complexity can really create barriers there, and you can potentially lose interest from people and they can go away from your site as well, especially if you're just talking about the online environment and everything is through written text. So it's about kind of thinking about them and using language in an easy way that more people can understand.
Okay. Is that the same? It's with yourself, Carrie? Is this the type of the profile, the client profile that you work with?
Absolutely, all those examples. And then just to expand slightly on that, there are other elements as well. So a lot of the work that we do is to do with accessibility, both digitally and kind of verbally and verbal communications. So it's not only about English being plain to those people that understand English, but when you talk about languages, the translations that you must make for the people where English is not their first language, that also comes across to such as the deaf community and BSL. So BSL is its own language, and you have to be able to communicate with people such as the deaf community and have things translated for them. It's also, like you said, like Niamh said about the websites, are they accessible from a language point of view, but are they actually physically accessible as well? So people who are blind or have visual impairments, are they accessible to those? Are they compatible with screen reading technology? Things like that. So it's just taking into account all the different elements of language, both digitally and verbally.
Okay. I wonder, can you maybe paint a picture for us about what the experience is like for a person who has either like a physical or cognitive disability when it comes to apprehending language? What is they come across a website they can't understand? What is it like for them? What's the feedback that you've received from clients?
So for a lot of clients, quite often they can't even get as far as a cookie banner on a website. So they want a service, they Google said service, they get to the website and they use their screen reading technology. Now, depending on the cookie banner and how that's formed and depending on the website, they may get stuck at a certain point. So if on your website you haven't got colour differentiation between different sections, if you can't tab across, so the menu at the top where you say about us, our people, contact us, they may not be able to tab across there. If they reach these barriers and they can't get as far as even your, say, contact us page, not only can they not get the information, but they can't contact you to get that information either. So there might be a number of businesses and business owners that aren't getting the clients and the clients can't get to them. So immediately services have a barrier and they can't reach the services. With the deaf community, we've just implemented signed video, because if for a lot of the deaf community, English is not their first language, their written English might not be to a standard where they feel comfortable emailing. So again, they need a way to be able to speak to somebody that obviously isn't a phone call. So there's different platforms where they can have an interpreted conversation and they can use that to speak to that person and gather that information. So it's just about removing these barriers and thinking that step further, really.
So there's the component that it's kind of must be upsetting and a challenge for the person, but also the business itself is probably it may not know it's lost a potential sale, and may not know how to deal with that. Is that the same experience that from feedback that you've had, Niamh?
Yeah, I suppose we don't work on that scale with the physical things, but with the language as well. And I think even one of the elements there is about maybe thinking about the audience and having that empathy towards them as well, because especially with the last few years, what we've just come through, you know, there's been a lot more, you know, people couldn't go into retail, or they couldn't just talk to somebody in a shop. You know, they had to do things online, you know, people that maybe wouldn't have done things online before. So even on websites and things like that, sometimes the contact us can be buried. You know, it might not even just be easily across the top, and maybe we've all experienced it, that you know, you just can't find information in the website. And all it does really is, one, if you're a potential customer, you're going to lose a customer. But if you already are one, it's going to annoy them, and that brand loyalty as well, and reputation is, you know, can be impacted. So if you're using lots of words, long sentences, and hiding information because you don't want you don't want somebody to contact you, you know, you're really damaging brand reputation as well. And you know, there's a lot of organizations out there that it's a nightmare to try and get in touch with them, you know. So you see people taken to Twitter or something like that. You know, somebody just, I need to talk to somebody. So that, you know, beyond just how the information is presented, it is really going to turn people away from giving you more money, or staying with you as a loyal customer as well. So I think we've all even experienced that. And so that's something that kind of companies should also really consider when they're given instructions and things on the website.
And one thing that struck me when I was talking to both Carrie and Neve for the first time was that the same audience can actually, you know, you maybe really want to think about more than one way of communicating with the same audience. So thinking, for example, the deaf community, Carrie, you pointed out that for the deaf community, I guess by and large, BSL is the first language, not English, and most people who don't have a lot of contact with the deaf community probably don't realize that. I certainly didn't realize that. But that doesn't mean that in order to communicate with deaf people through a website, you have to focus entirely on BSL. And if you can't provide that, then give up. You can do that, and you can also simplify the written language. Both approaches can help the same people.
When we're talking about the population that kind of would benefit from these accessible kind of strategies, what are we talking about here? And like, do we have kind of numbers or statistics about how big this population is?
So I think the deaf community, last kind of campaign that we did, the figures are about 80,000 plus deaf community across the country. And that, like you say, Trevor, there are very different ways. You can also use kind of text relay and things like that. There are different formats. There are so many people. I don't know the figures between BSL users and non-BSL users within the deaf community, but there are different formats for different people. So you can adapt for the people that English is their first language, and there's a text to talk and a text type format and things like that. There's relay services. So you can adapt to that whole community in various different ways.
Yeah, and text to speech in that sense is a really powerful thing as well. Even if for people visually older customers, you know, older people, they might be able to see, especially if they're on their phone. You know, if you're trying to read things on your phone, it might be difficult as well. So there's a lot of different elements that if you're, you know, you might be thinking about people with certain abilities or disabilities, but bringing in some additional elements could actually benefit a cohort of people that you didn't even consider, you know, beforehand. You know, maybe you would like to listen to the website rather than read it as well while you're walking down the street, you know, things like that. So so there's a lot of different ways to look at it. How do you communicate your message, your product, your brand, so that it kind of covers more segments of the population rather than cutting them out? And even with dyslexia, it's like 15% of the population. And then, you know, in the UK, there's a lot of people with, I think literacy is like 70% as well, people with a lower literacy level as well. So the different perspectives could be, you know, more wide reaching, I think.
Yeah. From kind of a legal perspective, since we've got you here, Gary, you're the expert here. What is the prevalence of of cases that are kind of across your desk, I suppose. Have you noticed any kind of peaks and valleys? Like, are they getting more because of like what Neve said about, everyone has to, all the businesses have had to go online because of the pandemic and are being approaching these challenges. A lot of the opportunities are being taken away. You can't go into a bank branch, for instance. You have to do everything online. What is the prevalence of kind of discrimination that's coming across your desk these days?
Enormous, to be honest. Obviously the pandemic has brought with it its own challenges, like you say. One of the biggest ones that I've seen personally was the matter against the Prime Minister. So I was involved in a case against him for the deaf community because he didn't have an interpreter for any of his briefings.
Sorry, this was Boris Johnson?
This is, unfortunately.
Okay.
I know. So yeah, we wrote to Government Legal Department because they'd failed to put an interpreter on for any of the briefings. So the deaf community, as we said, the 80,000 plus people at the beginning of the lockdown didn't have any of the information that they needed. They didn't know about the rules. They didn't know about the fines. I had clients that were coming to me that were fined on the spot for being out and about and getting on with their daily lives because they weren't aware of the rules. And obviously at the time and even now, it's life or death. It's very serious. And they failed to interpret any of that for the whole deaf community. So that was enormous. We had 300 clients approach us quite quickly at my old firm. And that, like I say, the community that affects is far and wide. We also had a lot of problems with face masks. So the deaf community going into hospitals and GPs and things having to wear face masks. They lip read and rely quite heavily on lip reading. And that is obviously taken away. So that's another form of communication that they were kind of subjected or failed to have amended or adjusted to. That was quite a big problem. There was so many of them, especially when lockdown happened and there was no kind of deliveries from supermarkets. There was barriers being put up in supermarkets, so wheelchairs couldn't access. One-way systems would really affect people with mobility issues. The pandemic just caused such a kind of plethora of issues for all kind of sorts of communities, and it's the most I've ever seen kind of in one hit, if you like. Just it was madness.
I think that's a really valid point, Carrie, about the supermarkets and people's access to things that they would ordinarily have access to. So we've just moved to the Lake District, and one of the retail stores, which I won't name it, but I've noticed that in the fresh food aisle. So I used to shop at the same store in Ripon, and now I've gone to the same store here in Penrith. There's a Perspex screen on across all of the fruit and veg. Now, if I was a wheelchair user or I had mobility issues, there's absolutely no way that I would be able to access any of the produce behind those screens because I have to open the door outwards, and it's a Perspex screen from floor to ceiling. So it's probably 7 or 8 feet high. The handle, which is a hole in the Perspex, is higher than it needs to be for somebody that would be in a wheelchair. So there hasn't been any thought there on how those people are going to access those services. And I actually had a look yesterday morning when I was in the store, and there isn't any signage to say if you need support getting the produce out. So there was nothing. So I think these people in those situations are clearly being overlooked because they're not the masses, perhaps.
Absolutely. And we saw so much of that through the pandemic, even with home deliveries. So before any of this happened, there would be people that had home deliveries because they were clinically vulnerable. They didn't leave the house. They were agoraphobic. They had mobility issues. They didn't have support or carers. And when the pandemic happened, everybody and their grandma went on online delivery, and everybody needed those slots. So the people that really needed them, the people that were clinically vulnerable, couldn't access those slots. They couldn't get deliveries. And it was about getting to the supermarkets and saying, no, really, this is a priority. The people that physically can't get to the store need to be a priority. And then the people that would rather not go to the store because of COVID, fair enough. And it's just about thinking forward and who is this affecting and on what level. We had clients that literally had dog food left in the house and they couldn't get anything else. They had no support, no family, no local stores. It was terrifying, to be honest, at the outset.
Wow. It's just it's this case after case of I mean, you can understand exactly how it happens with businesses like reacting, doing knee-jerk reactions. Okay, we have to do this, we have to do all these precautions, but not seeing the big picture, or seeing or including everybody in that, and those who's this going to affect, who is this going to negatively affect. I think this leads really well into Paul's story, because I think it's a great example of how Paul was he was confronted with in a situation, and you needed to react to, and you changed on the spot to adapt. And I wonder if you could share that story about what was your presentation when you. I wonder if you can tell that story, Paul.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So there was a charity that we were dealing with, or wanted to deal with. So it was a prospective client. So for our will writing service, and I'd had a few verbal conversations and a video call with one of the two founders of this charity, and we'd arranged a particular day to run through the presentation, and the presentation was largely a PowerPoint presentation. So it's visual, it's audio and visual, because I was expecting he and I and two other people to be on the call, and the charity in question it's a blind charity, and the person is a blind driver, a blind racing driver. And so what happened was, I was expecting one representative from the charity on the call who was somebody that had full sight, and the chap who is the other founder, who is the blind racing driver, appeared on the screen. And my immediate reaction was horror, because I thought, how's this going to work? I've got a presentation, which is a visual presentation, and how am I going to present this to somebody that's blind? So my second response was to confront the chap who was blind. And I actually said to him, I said, look, I wasn't expecting you on the call today, but I'm really grateful that you're here. The presentation that we're normally going to run through would be a visual presentation on PowerPoint. Now, I understand that you can't see that PowerPoint. So if it would be okay with you, what I would like to do is, each slide that I put up, I'll explain what's on the slide, and I'll talk through it, and I'll read all of the words on the slides. And he was quite grateful for that. So we ran the presentation. It ended up running for about maybe 12 or 15 minutes longer than it usually would. And at the end of the presentation, he actually said that he'd been on several other video calls over the last 18 months during the pandemic. And pretty much 100% of the time, he'd been ignored on those calls, because people didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to approach the subject. So they just ignored the fact he was even in the meeting. Whereas what I'd done, because I'd made him the focal point of the meeting, because everybody else could see and hear what I was doing, he was really appreciative of the fact. And he said, unbeknownst to you, he said, you've done something really powerful for me, because as you were talking, I was able to visualize what was on the slide. So in my mind, I could see what everybody else could see with their eyes. And that was really powerful for me, actually, because it's something that I'd never experienced before. I've always been pretty good and adaptable to change, but I'd never been in that situation before. So that was that was quite a unique situation for me, but it was something that was very much eye-opening for me. And it was in the middle of a sequence of events. So there was a series of a few weeks where different things happened for different people with diversity or language issues that I'd had to overcome, or I'd had to face. So yeah, that was really quite profound.
Do you know, Paul, what struck me when I first heard that story from you, a couple of things that struck me. First, I think you were lucky to have been in a situation where you could recognize that that's what your audience was facing, because you could see the person, you knew who you were dealing with, because it was a call, right?
Yeah.
But it turned a light on for me, because it made me realize how often we don't even know who our audience is. So
yeah.
you're creating a web page, you're writing a blog, you're in my case as a solicitor, I'm drafting a contract. A lot of the stuff that I will write will end up being used by my clients. It'll be their terms of business, for example, that they'll put on their web shop. And so it'll be members of the public, people I haven't seen, I don't know what their capabilities are. That's my audience. And an experience that you've described like that, you got an opportunity, I guess it was sort of thrust at you. You were well, not forced to confront it. A lot of people might have just sort of ignored the problem and just plowed on and done what they were going to do anyway without accommodating that person's needs. But still, yeah, I'm looking at this screen here. We've got a number of people in this call today, but who else is going to look at this video afterwards? We don't know what their needs are. And so just it's about thinking about and empathizing for all the various different kinds of audiences that we're all facing when we're trying to get ideas across, whether it's on a PowerPoint, in a written document, on a verbally even. What words do we choose, and how do we express ourselves to make sure not so much that I get my message out. I mean, that's a lot less important than making sure that I understand what's being received at the other end. Because if what's received at the other end doesn't work and doesn't match what I'm trying to tell people, then I haven't done my job.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
It's a really great story, because it's kind of like the second part, or it doesn't end there, does it, Paul? Because it kind of, that was like you said, it was a sequence of events that kind of, it was your journey almost in a changing mindset.
Yeah. Do you know what? There was I think it was a 6 or 7 week period where that was right in the middle of a sequence of events that happened. That was really the catalyst of why I'm here now, because I've always just assumed that I was an okay communicator, and we do assume this, don't we? We assume that people are going to see and hear what I see and hear, but that's absolutely not the case. So another example would be in my other business, one of our networking groups. It was a male dominance group, and we understand the complexities of what that brings. So we wanted to make the group more gender diverse. So we'd had a conversation with the guys in the room saying, look, we don't want to have a boys club. Do we want to have more females present in the room, which would make the group better in the whole sense of the being? But so naively, what I'd done is I'd asked some females that were part of another group in my network if they would like to come along to the meeting that we were having. So we had more of a female presence in the room. I was very innocent in doing this, but after I'd had a physical meeting with two of the three ladies that I'd asked, I asked them. I said, "Oh, the event's been and gone. Why didn't was you not able to come?" And the response that I got was, "Well, it was really nice to be asked, but what you asked was the wrong question. That's why we didn't come." And I was like, "Oh, okay. Why was it the wrong question?" And they said, "Well, if you'd have asked for an accountant and a travel agent and a mortgage broker to come along, we probably would have jumped at the chance. But you asked us to come along because we were women, not because we were good at what we did." And that was quite offensive. And they said, and I was like, "Do you know what? I didn't think about it in that way." And she said to me, "Do you know what?" She said, "It would be a little bit like me asking you to come to an event because we need a little bit of color in the room." She says, "It might not be offensive, but it's kind of the same thing." And then I thought about it and I was like, "Do you know what? I'm actually so sorry that I overlooked that." So I apologized. And what these series of events are making me do is making me look at our communication, not as the deliverers of the communication, but we're now thinking about what we do and how are other people going to construe our messages? How are they going to think and feel about it? And that's having a really big effect on what we do on what we do across the businesses and how we do our marketing. How are people going to receive the messages that we're putting out, or can they even receive the messages? That's the more important thing, isn't it? Is somebody going to hear what I'm saying, or are they going to hear what they want to hear, or their version of what was said? So, it's something that I'd never thought of before. I've been 30 years in business and I've never really thought about communication in that way before.
That's true.
Alternative is they don't understand, so they just tune you out.
Yeah,
that's another possible problem.
Yeah, they do. Yeah. So the in the middle of all of this is where we met, where I met Carrie, and the conversation that we had about it. And I think because of these situations that have been occurring that we're having to overcome and think about, there was another chap was contacting me via a message on a social media platform, and he was quite insistent, and he'd been asking for feedback regularly, but he only wanted feedback by text, and it was kind of being blinkered because I didn't view it as being important, so I didn't really do anything with it. I thought I'll do it when I'm ready to do it, and then but because these other events had been going on in the background, I was kind of looking at his communication. Then I started thinking, well, okay, flipping it on its head, why would somebody want to only communicate with me by email? So then I went back to the person that introduced me to that person, and I said, why would that person only want to communicate with me by email? And they said, oh, it's Gary's deaf. So he wouldn't be comfortable coming doing a video call, and he can't do a telephone call. Gary now works with us. He works with my organization now. So we went out of our way to recruit Gary, and now Gary's doing a great job. Gary's one of our liaison people who introduces us to charities. And Gary's fantastic. So it's, I think, just thinking about things in a different way and thinking about other people first is it's kind of proving to be a much better way to conduct business for me.
And what kind of feedback have you gotten from, well, because you've kind of seen both sides of it too, with the guy in the audience who, with the visual impairment, he gave you like, this is the first time this has happened, and then you've got like your this employee. What kind of feedback are you getting from your customers now with Gary working with them?
Well, do you know the funny thing? So there's a couple of organizations that Gary has introduced us to that we previously tried to communicate with, and for whatever reason, we weren't being responded to. But because we've taken on a totally different dynamic and a totally different way to try and communicate with that customer for a different reason, we've now had 2 meetings with companies that we previously tried to have meetings with before that wouldn't hear it. They weren't hearing our message. But now through Gary, they're hearing a different message with a different, not a different voice, but a different mode of communication. So the feedback from him is he's absolutely ecstatic. So now Gary, and I'm sure he wouldn't mind me saying, not that anybody knows who Gary is, but Gary's having a bit of a tough time at the moment. You know, he's through the pandemic, his employment had changed, his mental state wasn't amazing. He was finding it difficult to find work. And here he is now working with a company that's embracing his, I don't even want to call it a disability because it isn't one of those. He just has a hearing impediment. So now Gary's knocking it out of the park because he's so enthused because he's got something that he feels valued for. He can't get enough. He messaged me last week and said, would you have a problem if I worked for you if I was in Spain? And I was like, why would you want to work for us in Spain? He was like, well, every year I go to Spain for 4 weeks for a break, but would you mind if I do you mind if I still did some work in Spain? I was like, Gary, you can do work wherever you want, but don't work while you're on holiday. And he was like, no, but I really love it. So he's going to go and work while he's going away. He's not back to the 1st of March. So I said, look, if you want to do it, it's totally your prerogative. I don't want you to. And he's like, no, I really want to. So it's totally different. You know, I've gone from an environment of trying to get people to do more, better work to people wanting to do work. It's totally different.
It's a
totally different dynamic that I'm finding in thinking about other people's feelings and how they interact with us is totally different to anything I've experienced before.
And there's a really big learning point there too, isn't it? Because companies these days, but for a long time, they've been worried about what is it, CSR, corporate social responsibility. It's called something else now. I can't remember what the new acronym is.
ESG now, I think, which is what, environmental, social, and corporate governance. But that's just basically CSR on a slight dose of steroids with a bit of rebranding.
But that's the thing, and about about actually what Paul has done is he's actually kind of walking the talk, instead of kind of just doing a little band-aid here and saying, hey, we're being accessible, rah 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 kind of thing. The difference is, I mean, it's palpable, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. In the past, I've been guilty of doing it. I've written a CSR policy, and we've had environmental policy statements and all this wonderful stuff. We're just recycling the same as everybody else, and we've embellished and we've made it sound wonderful, and we've put it on the website. But actually working with somebody and making a difference to somebody's life is making a difference to them, and a difference to us, and a difference to the companies that they're communicating with, because everybody benefits from that scenario, right? Whereas on the other side, for companies that don't want to embrace those things, everybody loses. So now I'm kind of torn between, we do want to recruit, but I'm kind of torn between a rock and a hard place, because I want more people like Gary, but how do I do that? Because I can't just advertise for people with other impairments to come on board with us, because then I'm discriminating against people that don't have any. But in the fullness of time, I'm sure we'll figure it all out. But having people like Carrie to keep us on the straight and narrow, we had a couple of conversations, and we only spoke twice, and look at the difference that you've made to my businesses already. It's phenomenal.
I guess that's the thing too, is it's about people, it's about the kind of the mindset, the awareness that this is of accessibility, and how, but then the big question is like, well, how, like you said, how I'm just recycling, I'm thinking I'm being accessible, but what are some real ways of, and maybe we'll spend the next kind of, I'm just looking at the clock, about the next few minutes, maybe just brainstorming some of these kind of simple ways of being accessible, or for businesses to check out, okay, well, I think I'm being accessible. Am I actually being, is it quite as accessible as I think it is? What are some ideas? And please, all of our, any of the guests that we have, please just type in any questions you have in the chat box. But yeah.
I might just start, I want to just drop in and even just say to Paul, like, I really commend you on what you've done, because you're making it sound like it was really easy, like you met these people and okay, everything changed. At every point of those instances, you had a choice to make. You had a choice: do I acknowledge this, or do I continue on the way I've always been doing? And you've made a choice to acknowledge that, and like you said, make changes in your organization, which is amazing. And sometimes people don't recognize that they're at a turning point, that they can do something differently. So I think that's amazing, and the changes that you're feeling in that. And I think as time goes on, it will develop. So I think that's amazing, first of all. And just from talking about a language perspective, like, if people just even want to think about, is the language that I'm using, is it accessible? There's some very simple tips that you could even do, just looking at your own website. When you use really long sentences, it can be one thing that Trevor, you actually shared there, said there's a difference between the message sent and the message received. So when you use really long sentences, words that you wouldn't use in your normal everyday conversations, when you use all of these things, you put a lot of cognitive load, or you put a lot of processing and a lot of burdening on the user, on the reader, whatever. So in a simple way, what you can do is even count on your website how many words are in a sentence. If you have sentences that are going to have more than 20 words, more than 30 words, you're putting too much of a burden on the user. Look at even read it out loud for yourself. And if it doesn't even sound natural, the way you would speak with someone, or the words that you would use for somebody, then it probably isn't that natural, and it probably isn't using common everyday words that in a conversation you would use differently as well. So just even count the words in your sentences, shorten it, be more concise, and use things that are more language that you would use in a conversation is kind of just the first piece that you can just do in a simple way.
How about you, Carrie? What tips would you share with people?
There's a lot, I think there's a lot people think commercially, oh, I can't do that, it's going to cost too much, or it's going to be, like you say, a burden to the business or difficult to implement. And there's so much you can do that doesn't actually cost a thing or is minimal cost. It's just about making adaptations. Speak to your clients and your client base and see what their needs are and how to adapt best to them. Sometimes it's as little as picking the phone up and reading through a document with them. Trevor will know from a legal point of view, we can write things that even I struggle to get my head around, and I've trained in it, never mind a layperson. And it's about making that into plain English. And even then, pick the phone up and speak through it with somebody, read it to them if need be. I have clients that have dyslexia, and it's about reading it to them and helping them understand, or seeing if they've got the technology themselves that is a text to read things and it can read it out for them. So they might have struggles reading, but they can listen and they'll take it all in that way. Just with the languages, and when we were saying earlier about BSL, if it's not a case of having to interpret every time you speak to a person, if you have standard documents like your terms and conditions, they're the same every single time, ask an interpreter to record a video while they're interpreting those terms and conditions and save that video, and you can use that every time you sign up a new client. If it's your website, obviously we've touched on, there's things you can do with your website. There are website accessibility specialists that can do a small audit and just tell you how to tweak things. Again, very little cost, if any cost at all. People with dexterity issues, obviously with COVID, people coming into your businesses, you tend to ask them to write things down or scan things. They might have dexterity issues where they can't do that. So make it that you take their information, or use an iPad so it's touchscreen and it's a lot easier than writing or grabbing a pen or whatever it might be. You can do that the same with electronic signatures rather than physical wet signatures in a lot of places. Things like I've been asked to do a blog recently, and that's fine, but with that blog I want to do obviously the speaking and the conversation, but then I want to have auto captions so that there's words along the bottom of the video, so anyone that can't hear me can read that. And again, if it's text and you can highlight the text, your computer or your laptop can read that out as well. And also if you're posting images and there's a lot of imagery on your websites, things like that, just put a caption at the bottom saying what this image is. So there's just little things that cost very little that you can just make small adaptations that make you that much more accessible to your entire client base.
That's really good, Carrie. There's a comment from Peggy that's just come in. She has a question kind of leading into the graphics. She's works from a marketing perspective, and she says she's wondering if she knows that camel case, and I apologize, Peggy, I don't know what the camel case means when it comes to hashtags, but she says she's now wondering about the use of emojis since they're used a lot and more and more in marketing. How are emojis translated via screen reading apps?
That's a new one, to be honest. I'm not sure. I know there's I think some of them do say like smiley face and things like that. So I do think some of them do. I'm not sure about all of them. So I will do some research. But I do think they read something out depending on the emoji.
I'm really hoping that eggplant's just an eggplant.
Carrie, I have a question, Carrie. Is there like a place that people can go where there's an easy crib sheet for, for example, if we're creating a website, here's some do's and don'ts. Is there somewhere that they can go to find that information? There
is. It's not brilliant. So there is government website. There's a government guidance to it, and it's called, so basically it's AA, AAA, single A accessibility. And you have to do an accessibility statement on your website to say that you either reached single A standard, AA standard, whatever it might be. It's good as a starting post. It's good to kind of get some information from that. And it gives you kind of, I don't know the technicalities and the IT behind it, but coding to do and things like that. So you can have a look on that. So there's a government website that I'll try and find and post to you, but you can just Google kind of government guidance on it. But it's difficult because it says kind of you have to be AA, but nowhere in that does it say anything about the single A standards, and you've got to tick those boxes first. So common sense says you have to do single before you do the double, but it's not actually published. It's quite difficult. But yeah.
From I know of a software tool called GetStark that would they audit. I think you can even just do it with your URL or with an API key, that they will look at the visual aspects of it, like looking at the alt text and the images, and then looking at the color contrasts as well, you know, for visual impairment, color blindness, things like that. So Get Stark is one, but we can I can share it with Lucas afterwards and share it out, whatever. So there are a few different things that you can maybe use in lots of different ways, and we do it from the language perspective as well. So, but the visuals there, I think there's lots of information in different places, but not maybe one cohesive part, because just going on that comment there, awareness. I think the awareness piece is only really kind of starting to happen now, even though we've all been using the internet and thing for a long time. I think that people are becoming more empathetic towards their audience and seeing that, you know, it's good for people, it's good for branding and business, you know, at the end of the day as well. So I think it's definitely an increase.
Yeah, and it's not just the tools. I think it's also the like the technical tools. It's also the tools of how do you sell this to the organization or the business that you're trying to convince to do things differently. And we've used the word accessibility an awful lot in this conversation today. And one thing that keeps occurring to me is that accessibility is actually almost the same. Well, it's almost interchangeable with approachability. You know, if you think about it from the user experience point of view, it's not just I can access this, it's that this business or this organization is open to me. They are looking out for me, they are welcoming me. And if you're sending that message to a segment of the market that other people aren't sending that message, just, you know, maybe think about how powerful that is. And approaching it that way, going to a board of directors or you know, management, saying, can we get some resources to, you know, look at the accessibility of our website, et cetera. Maybe it's the approachability that you need to look at.
I think that's a great point. And I think it's a great place to end. I'm looking at the clock and we've just gone over time a bit. So I'm a bit irritated at all of my panel for being so verbose. Anyway, thank you for
so
everybody.
Interesting.
It was a great talk. Anyway, we will wrap it up though. Thank you everyone. Thank you to all of our panel for joining us. Thank you to our guests with your questions and your comments. Again, the next roundtable will be in March on the 17th, and watch for the link that will go up probably later next week. And we will see you then. Have a great rest of the week, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.